Once we learn a little bit about the population size and how a population is growing, we can then start to look at the factors that would be affecting the population's ability to continue to grow. So in other words, we can look at what factors might be causing that logistic growth in a population. Because we said that exponential growth can't happen for a long time. And the reason is that things like competition, limiting resources, community interactions are all going to limit how much a population can grow in a particular area. So there are a few different things that we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss density independent and density dependent factors that affect a population. And then we're also going to talk about community interactions. So an ecological community is all of the living populations in an area. So these are going to be what we would call the biotic factors. Bio meaning life. So all of the living interactions in a population. And we can also look at the abiotic factors or the non-living factors. And all of these are things, these community interactions, these abiotic interactions, the biotic interactions, they're all going to affect how an organism or a population is able to survive in their particular set of resources. And it's also going to affect how quickly they grow. So a density independent factor is a mortality factor, meaning it is something that causes animals to die, but it is not affected by changes in population size or density. So in other words, it doesn't matter how many individuals are in a population, those individuals are going to be affected in the same way. So if we look at this graph on the right, we've got population density on the x-axis, mortality rate on the y-axis. So basically this graph in the middle is showing us that it doesn't matter if we have one individual or we have a whole bunch. Their mortality is being affected in exactly the same way. Density independent factors tend to be physical or abiotic factors. So things like weather, drought, flood, fire. These are not things that our organisms are competing over. They are things that basically are out of control of the living world. Not that the living world is controlling one another, but so for example, if we have a flood and that flood overflows the riverbanks and affects some birds that are nested along that riverbank. Now, it doesn't matter if there are 3 bird nests or 300 bird nests. When that river overflows its banks, it's going to flood the nests. It's going to kill the birds. So again, it doesn't matter if it is a low population density or high population density, every animal that is in that area is going to be affected in the same way. Another example might be if there is a fire and that fire goes through a meadow, it's going to kill all of the grass, whether there's a lot of grass or a little grass. Then we have density dependent factors. These are generally going to be your living factors, your biotic components to the community. And with a density dependent factor, your mortality factor changes depending on the population density. So the effect of that factor is going to change depending on whether there's a small number of individuals or a large number of individuals. And so our other 2 graphs here, we've got the red line going down, the purple line going up. And these are indicating mortality rates that change as the population size changes. So if we look at the inverse density dependent factor, this is something that as the population increases, the factor decreases. For a density dependent factor, as the population density increases, that factor increases as well. So these are tending to be interactions between organisms. So for example, disease is a fabulous example of a density dependent factor. The more organisms there are in a particular area, the more likely they are going to pass on that disease. And you are all familiar with this from the winter when everybody's inside. You have more close contact with people, you spread disease more easily. It's the exact same thing in animal populations. So we're going to go through some different density dependent factors. We're going to talk about predation and the types of predation that there are. We're going to talk about competition, and we're going to talk about pathogens. So we are kind of moving here from population interactions to community interactions. So a community, remember, is all of the living organisms. So we are looking at community level, which is interaction of populations. So we're looking at how organisms interact with other organisms of a different species. So there are several different general types of interactions. We've got these interactions based on whether or not they are positive, negative, or neutral for other organisms that are involved in this interaction. So this picture is really great because it shows the first 3 interactions on our list, and it just shows you how they are interacting with one another. So first we've got competition. Competition is going to be a negative interaction, negative for both organisms. So I would like you to look at this picture on the right hand side and think about the competition interaction that they're showing here and how it would be negative for each one. Then we've got mutualism. Mutualism is positive for both species. So both species are benefiting. So this interaction is on the bottom. We've got the gut bacteria interacting with the rabbits. So this one might not be quite as obvious to you if you are unfamiliar with gut bacteria, but if you've heard anything about gut health recently, what that's referring to is the bacteria that are living in your intestines. And there's this fabulous little community of bacteria inside your intestines that are doing all kinds of great things for you, including helping you digest your food, making you vitamins, things like that. And so they do the same thing in these herbivores. But for herbivores, they also help break down some of the plant fibers that they cannot break down on their own. So the bacteria in the rabbit gut are doing all of these things, and then they are also gaining nutrients from the food that the rabbits eat. Then we've got predation, herbivory, and parasitism. You are probably all familiar with predation and herbivory. We'll talk about those in just a minute. These are going to be negative for one, positive for the other. So I would, again, like you to look at this image, look at the predation example, and just think about how it's positive for one, how it's negative for the other. The other two aren't actually shown here on this image. We've got commensalism and amensalism. So these are opposite. Commensalism means positive for one, neutral for another. So neither positive nor negative for the other. And then we've got amensalism. This is an interaction that is negative for one species and neutral for the other. So predation is one of our big interactions, and you are probably all familiar with examples of predation. So when I think of predation, I think of our big mammalian predators, our lions, our mountain lions, bears, things like that. You might also be thinking of sharks or killer whales. So I call that the National Geographic lecture. This is the stuff that you are probably all familiar with from high school science, maybe other biology classes, from watching TV and whatnot. One thing that I forget is that herbivory or herbivores eating grass is actually a predator-prey. The plant that is being eaten is the prey species, and the herbivore is the predator. So an herbivore is an organism that exclusively eats plants. And so this is analogous to a predator eating another animal, except we've got an animal preying on a plant. And then we've got parasites. So parasites are organisms that utilize another organism to complete their life cycle. So usually parasites don't kill their host. And the reason for this is if they kill their host, then they have now lost their host. So parasites by definition don't tend to kill their host. That doesn't mean they never do, but the goal of parasitism is actually not to kill their hosts. And then we've got parasitoids, which I have listed here, but we're not really going to talk about them too much just because we have a limited time. A parasitoid is basically a pseudoparasite that ends up killing their host. So predators, herbivores, and parasites are basically sort of defined by how lethal they are and the length of this association with their prey. So we've got this graph that shows the duration of the interaction. So short duration down here, long duration here, and then we've got lethality. So we've got low lethality and we've got high lethality. So you can kind of see on this graph where each of these falls. So we've got our herbivores down in the corner. They're probably grazing through an area. They're probably not killing the entire grass plant. They're eating some leaves, but that grass is probably going to grow back and they're just going to continue to graze through. So they're relatively low lethality and their duration of the interaction is pretty low as well. Then we got parasites. Remember that I said that parasites tend to not kill their host, which means they have low lethality, but once parasites infect, they don't really go away, or it's hard to get rid of them. So they're going to have a long duration of interaction. And then you all know predators, their goal is to kill their prey because they need a meal. So they have high lethality, but the interaction is probably relatively quick. They're going to catch their prey quickly and kill it quickly, or that prey is going to get away relatively quickly. Predator-prey relationships can be very complicated because our predators have evolved lots of mechanisms to catch their prey. We've got big claws, we've got large teeth, we've got strength. We've got sneaky behaviors, things like that. We've got camouflage. So predators have evolved all of these great ways to kill their prey, but prey have also evolved all of these fancy mechanisms to evade their predators. So what we have over time is essentially a predator-prey arms race. One of them gets a little bit better at being a predator, so one of them gets a little bit better at not dying, and so on. So there are a few defense mechanisms that tend to be common throughout the living world. So we're going to go through, generally just give some examples of these because their names tend to just kind of tell you what they are. But the first example that we're going to cover is chemical and mechanical defenses. On this page before we move, we've got examples of camouflage. This is a rattlesnake. And you can see that he is very well camouflaged. But in this case, the predator is the one that is camouflaged to hide from the prey. Then down here, we've got a leaf lizard. You can see that he is camouflaged to look like the leaves that he's climbing on, so the leaves in his environment, and that is so that he can hide. We're also going to very quickly cover mimicry, intimidation, and then armor as well. So on this slide, we have a couple of examples of mostly chemical defenses. So a chemical defense is going to be something like a poison or a substance that is produced that tastes bad, anything to basically deter the predators. So we're looking to deter the predators here. An example of this on the right hand side is the bombardier beetle. It ejects hot acid from its abdomen. So you can see that squirt there. So that is clearly a chemical defense. It could also be a mechanical defense. This might scare them a predator away from them. We've also got this blue poison arrow frog. So these guys secrete poison through their skin. So if anything eats it, they're going to have the poison. So it acts as a deterrent. Along with that chemical defense, we actually have something called aposematic coloration. So this is warning coloration that just tells predators that they taste bad. Generally, aside from flowers, if we have animals, insects that are really brightly colored, those guys are often going to have some sort of chemical defense. So it's a poison or it's something that tastes bad. Just a little side note, a poison is passive. So this frog is secreting a poison, but a venom is basically something that's used on purpose. So this rattlesnake back on the other side, he's got these fangs in the front, and he can control and inject venom into his prey. So just a little side note there, poison and venom are not the same thing. In plants, they also use chemical defenses. These are usually something called a secondary metabolite. So a secondary metabolite is a chemical that is not required for survival, but it's something that is going to be helpful. So it might be something that tastes bad or just sort of gives them a little bit of a benefit in their environment. So we've got a couple of things here. You'll recognize that all of these are things that we use, that we have taken from animals. We have taken from plants. But a lot of these are going to be essentially deterrents for other organisms. Then we've got camouflage. The animal kingdom is abundant with examples of camouflage. This camouflage is just going to allow an organism to blend in with their environment. So we've got a couple cool examples here. We've got this owl hanging out in the crook of the tree. We've got this stick insect that is going to blend in with the twigs that are on a tree. We've got this lovely, cute little pygmy seahorse here that just blends right in with an anemone or a sea urchin or something in its environment.